Let me tell you what my deep research and basically vision is.
I hope there's Bigfoot. I don't think there is.
I'm not telling you nothing.
The aliens won't let it happen.
Happening now, breaking.
Bernie Sanders is angry.
Bears beats Battlestar Galactica.
What are the tips? Give me some tips on how to work with Wes Anderson.
Be ready to speak very fast and very clearly, because that's definitely one key thing.
I will only tell the truth.
Until you and 6 kids you barely know in wet bathing suits have surrounded 9 chimpanzees outside of a Wendy's, you probably really don't know yourself, okay?
Yep. And we back.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to your new favorite podcast and the best in political, sports, and paranormal news coverage. I'm your host, Wes Anderson, and this is In the Shed. This is episode 71, so whether you're coming back for more or finding us for the first time this week, hey, thanks for tuning in. Our guest tonight is a scholar and a gentleman, a history buff and philosopher. You know him, you love him, our returning champion, Joshua Bartholomew Teasley Jr. III, JBT3. Welcome back into the shed.
Thank you for having me back on. It's always fun to come in and just talk with y'all for a little bit.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk some philosophy tonight, is that right?
That's true.
Very good.
Just some different topics that I've encountered over my time studying philosophy, because for those who didn't know, I'm both a history and a philosophy major, and I actually just graduated.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But we're just going to be talking about some of the stuff that I found interesting, and just leave some questions out there for y'all to think about.
Sounds good. Well, let's dive into it with this question right off the bat, Mr. Philosophy. What is a woman? I'm just jerking your chain. Please don't answer that question. Let me answer that question for you. A woman is the one that's usually disappointed in me. That is what a woman is. Thought I'd throw you through a loop there to start us off. I'm just messing with you, Joshua. So what do you have for us? What's first on your talking points tonight?
So one of the first things I wanted to talk about, if you take any philosophy class pretty much anywhere, the first thing you ever learn is kind of how to do philosophy. And it's really important to understand the differences between like a philosophical conversation or debate between, say, like a political debate. Because the whole goal between the two they're just so completely different. So you take like a political debate, for example. The whole purpose is to be correct. It's to be right. It's to prove your opponent wrong. It's to push them down, make them look weak, make yourself look stronger. That is nothing like what a philosophical debate is. The point of a philosophical debate is to figure out what is right, what is true, what is correct, even if that means you're not the one that figures it out. The way that I've had professors explain it to me is, imagine you had like a presidential election. So let me ask you a question really quick. Who do you think is going to be running in the 2024 presidential election? Just give me anybody who you think it might be.
Unfortunately, probably we will be selecting between the same two we did last time, Donald Trump and Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
Lovely. That's such an amazing selection, but we won't get into that. But imagine that we're watching a debate next year, or
right.
This year now, between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And let's say that Donald Trump says to Joe Biden, Joe, your Build Back Better plan fails the working class because of X, Y, and Z. And Joe Biden looks at him and he stops for a second and he says, hang on, let me think about that. And he waits before answering. He's immediately lost the debate if he does that.
Right?
Like, he looks weak. He looks like he doesn't know what he's talking about. That is kind of highlights one of the differences. When we're doing a philosophical discussion, having a philosophical discussion or debate, we are here trying to figure out, like, what the correct thing is. We're not trying to win an argument or a debate. We are simply trying to figure out what is true.
And don't you think that's part of the problem with politics today, is that they're only there for a soundbite? It's not really even about what is correct or what is true. It's all about a gotcha moment.
Absolutely. And it's about looking the best that you can. I mean, that's what our political debates are at this point. We would be in a lot better shape if a lot more people read some philosophy or took some philosophy classes. We always often joked in a lot of my classes that we should just make a philosopher president. You know, at least we'll have somebody who will stop and think about it, although it's debatable about whether or not anything will actually get done.
Right.
But, yeah, everybody, like, doing philosophy would legitimately benefit everybody. A lot of people do philosophy without realizing it. There's so many questions that we ask ourselves on a daily basis that we don't realize are philosophical. But basically, let me take a step back and kind of give you like kind of a definition of what philosophy is. So the old Greek definition of philosophy essentially translates to a love of knowledge. And that's, whether or not you love it or not, that is kind of like what philosophy is about. It's like the study of, not necessarily the study of knowledge, but it's basically just like learning as much as we can and learning things. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. You have like questions like, say, that science can answer, so like things about the physical world.
Right.
And then you have philosophy, which answers basically the questions that science can't, or at least attempts to answer. One of the things is you're very often probably not going to get a very satisfactory answer, but you will nonetheless be attempting to answer something. That's kind of what the purpose of philosophy is. So we're trying to answer the questions that you don't necessarily answer through like observation and through like the scientific method.
Would it be fair to say that philosophy then is more about the process of asking and thinking about the questions more than it is arriving at an answer?
No, I wouldn't say that it's not. It's kind of like all of that. It's just as much about trying to get an answer as much as the process of thinking about it.
Okay.
When you're taking like a philosophy class, the purpose is much less to try to get to an actual answer and just to teach you how to think. That's like the purpose of taking philosophy classes, is it teaches you how to think critically about stuff, how to stop, listen to an argument, be able to understand it, and then go from there with trying to figure out how to answer it. But
I love it. We're all about that here in my shed, because I always try to say that I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm just trying to make you think.
Yes, and that is my whole purpose of all of these conversations that we'll be having tonight.
Very cool.
I don't care what anybody thinks. You know, you have your opinions, you have your own thoughts. I have no say about that. I just hope to at least get some people thinking, get you thinking about questions that maybe you didn't think you'd never thought of before, or things that you really didn't think were important or that interesting. Because one of the things that you learn when you study a lot of philosophy is that you can ask a philosophical question about just about anything. I mean, you could look around the room, pick anything, and there's probably some philosophical question that you could ask from it.
And you mentioned earlier that philosophical thinking is something that we do on a daily basis without realizing it. Can you give me a couple examples to help flesh that out? Like, what are some thoughts and thought processes that we go through on a daily basis that actually are philosophical in nature?
Sure, you may ask yourself on a daily basis, like, okay, let's say that you are at a grocery store and you pay, you check out, and you're going out and you load your groceries up into your car, and then you stop and think about if you're going to go and push the cart up into the into the cart return thing. That's actually a philosophical debate you're kind of having in your head. You're weighing whether or not it's something that you should do, whether or not it's right to do, your reasons for doing so. And some people actually consider this like a test of morality, because it's something that costs you next to nothing, like literally the lowest thing, maybe about 10 seconds of your time and energy, whether or not you go and push that cart back. And stuff like that. You may look and, like, say you look at a table in front of you. You may ask yourself, what does it mean for something to be a table? You may not ask, like, let me step back. You may not ask yourself that, but you may run into situations where it's like, hey, we're using so-and-so as a table. Like, we're using this. It's not meant as a table, as a table. And you can go from there and ask these questions, like, what does it take to make something a table? What qualities does it take? And that's actually something we're kind of going to talk about in just a little bit. But
well, interesting that you mentioned the shopping cart, because I am that person that considers it a test of morality. I am putting that shopping cart back if I'm in the middle of a monsoon. Only one time in my life did I not take the shopping cart back, in 1999, and it bothers me to this day.
Yeah, there's only been one time that I've never taken a shopping cart back because it was raining and I just wanted to get in my car. And unbeknownst to me, it rolled behind my car and I ended up backing into it. So that was my punishment for that, I suppose.
It could be worse. It could have hit an elderly person. Yeah. And then also you made me think about this, talking about the table. There was a group of friends and I that had a debate for years about what constitutes a sandwich. What makes a sandwich? What is and what is not a sandwich? Is a hot dog a sandwich? Is a taco a sandwich? Also had the same debate with the same group of friends about what is a salad. Would that be examples of philosophical questions?
Actually, the question of is a hot dog a sandwich was a huge debate in the UAB philosophy department.
Really?
Since I've been here. That has been a running joke for I don't know how long, because it is. I mean, it is a real question when you really think about it. Like, what does it take to make a sandwich? Yeah, the consensus that we got was that if it's not a sandwich, then it might possibly be a weird version of a taco. But I'm convinced that it's not either, that it's just its own thing. I don't think it's a sandwich. Sandwich has to be, like, kind of more closed instead of just in the bun. So. Well,
see, that's why I say a hot dog is an open-faced sandwich. That's what I think. Two pieces of bread, something like in the middle. All right. Okay. Enough sandwich talk here in the shed. What else is what's next for us in this conversation? Where are we going?
So I just wanted to start off with some of the beginning of at least Western philosophy, talk about some really classical stuff.
Okay.
So let me ask you, when you think of philosophy, do you have any particular names that come to mind?
Plato, Aristotle, names like that.
Yep. So we're going to talk about Aristotle. Really quickly, I want to take a step back and just kind of explain the three original or like main people of like ancient Greek philosophy. So you have Socrates, Plato, and then Aristotle.
Right.
And there's a saying that all modern philosophy is just a footnote to Plato, because he kind of set the foundations for like writing philosophy. Socrates didn't quite do that, even though he was kind of the first. Socrates didn't believe that you could ever write down philosophy. He didn't believe in that. So a lot of times, if you go back and like if you're reading the philosophy of Socrates, it wasn't actually him that wrote it. It was Plato, who was one of his students. And there's actually kind of a debate about whether Socrates was a real person or just a literary invention of Plato, because Plato loved to write. He was a huge writer.
Really?
Yeah. It doesn't have a whole lot of like grounding to it, because there are some other references to Socrates outside of philosophy, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong about that. But yeah, it is somewhat of a question about whether or not Socrates was a real person.
We'll have to do a show on that. We covered on this show one time, was Abraham Lincoln a real person? Because there are, I forget the exact number. At one time I knew this. I want to say like 4,000 people worldwide who adamantly believed that he was an invention of history and never a real person.
You know, people believe a lot of interesting things, but that's one that I don't understand, how you could think that he was not real.
Right.
Or think that, yeah, I don't know how you could think that he isn't real.
I don't get it either. So Socrates was first, Plato was a student of his, and then after them came Aristotle?
Aristotle was a student of Plato.
Okay, very good.
So we're going to start with just a little bit of Aristotle. I find a lot of the old Greek philosophy super boring. Some of it's just, it's dry. It's not fun to read, and it's not fun to listen to. There's some questions, but there's only a select few things that I really enjoyed. One of them that I found really interesting was what are called the Aristotelian four causes.
Okay.
So Aristotle stopped and thought about what it takes for something to exist, and what, in this case, what is something's cause for existing. Like, not necessarily like it's causal existing, but like what causes it to exist. And that doesn't mean something like how, like, say a virus may cause disease. It means something in the sense of like what leads to something existing. And it's a little hard to kind of understand. When you hear that, it may sound like I'm saying the exact same thing, just wording it a little bit differently, but there is a little bit of a difference. So the Aristotelian four causes, like I said, there's four. There's something called the material cause. So the material cause would just be like what it takes to make something up. So let's go back to when I was asking you about mentioning the question about like what it takes to make up a table.
Okay.
So like let's just imagine a table. So Aristotle believed that at the very basic level, you had the material cause. So that would be the thing that whatever the table is, that's what makes it up. So in this case, it would be, wood, maybe some pieces of metal, for like screws and stuff.
Right.
But it's what it takes to like make up a table. Then you have something that's called the efficient cause. Now the efficient cause would be what causes the table to exist. In this case, it could be something like the carpenter that builds the table. Whoever builds the table, they are the efficient cause. If you took something else, like say you took like a tree and you were looking at what its efficient cause would be, it could be something like, say, an acorn falls into the ground and begins to grow and grows into a tree. That could kind of be the efficient cause in that case.
Right.
So it's just what specifically is done, or what specific thing does something that causes, say, the table to exist. Are you following with me?
So far.
Okay. So after that, you then have something called the formal cause. Now, forms were something that many Greek philosophers talked about, and the forms were what it took to make up a certain thing. So you may have the form of a table. It's kind of like a blueprint, but it's not blueprint in the sense of its directions for how to like make something. It's simply the state of being that something has to exist in to be considered that thing. So what state does like the material have to exist in and be in order to be a table?
So wood and screws do not make a table, but if the screws are placed into the wood in such a way where they have 4 legs to stand and have a flat top, now it's a table.
Yes, and the idea is that there is some specific way, there is some specific form that the wood and screws have to exist in before they are actually able to be considered a table.
Okay.
Now, the last one is called the final cause, and the final cause it varies a whole lot based upon what specific thing what specific thing we're talking about. So the final cause for the case of the table would be like its reason for existing. So why does the table exist? Well, maybe it's because we needed a table. Why does the tree grow? Maybe we'll get back to that because that's a living thing. But if you take any like non-living thing, it has usually a reason that it exists. So the same thing with like you say you're talking about a house. Its final cause would be because you need some place to live, because it's meant to house people.
Right.
But then when you start getting into like living things, it gets a little more interesting. So say that you have, the example we always used in class was a tiger. When you get to the final cause of what it takes to make a tiger, or what the causes of a tiger are, what Aristotle believed and what a lot of the Greeks believed were that living things simply desired to exist in their forms. They desired to achieve the forms. So like, and I know this is going to sound a little odd, what a tiger ultimately would have desired would have been to achieve the form of a tiger. It was just a really interesting way of thinking, but it gets a little confusing because it's like, obviously, let's assume that the Aristotle's 4 causes are all completely correct. You can maybe ask yourself a question of, well, wait, if this is true, why didn't I desire to be a human? I just kind of existed as a human. And there really never was a good answer for that. It was just this thing that they kind of accepted of living things want to pursue and achieve the forms that they exist in. So that's pretty much the 4 causes. There's some other questions that can be kind of raised from that. A lot of people have asked, going back to the efficient cause, or it's also known as the moving cause, like the thing that like causes something else to exist. So let's think back about the table. The efficient cause could have been the carpenter, but then you can ask a question of, okay, well, let's take a step back. What caused the carpenter to exist? And then, you could maybe say the carpenter's parents, but then you keep going back and back, and eventually it seems like you're just having this like infinite regress of like efficient causes. And are you following with what I'm saying?
Yes.
So you're going just back and back, and it doesn't seem like there's going to be an answer. Aristotle had an answer, so other Greeks had an answer, and basically this idea of something called the prime mover. The prime mover would have basically been something like God. Basically a beginning point that requires no cause to exist, simply does exist. And this doesn't mean that they were necessarily saying that, like, oh, the answer here is like that God exists. What they were simply saying is there has to be a point at which there's something that no longer needs to be caused. It is simply exists. It's the very first moving cause, the very first efficient cause, and basically the beginning.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean that they were arguing to say that like God exists. It just means that they were saying there has to be a certain beginning point. We can't just keep going back with efficient causes. There has to be the beginning point, prime point where the movement begins.
This reminds me of when my daughter was a toddler and she would ask, well, where did that come from? Well, where did that come from? Well, where did that come from? And eventually I would get to the point where I said, I don't know. I guess God made it.
Yeah, and that is basically that's kind of what some of the ancient Greeks were saying. They didn't necessarily believe in God, but they believed that there had to be some kind of beginning point.
Which is interesting because we all have that thought process within us naturally, and they were able to kind of formalize it and bring it forth and kind of make it into a linear line of thinking.
And we're going to be asking questions like, you can only go back so far, or you seemingly can only go back so far, but it seems like with a lot of these questions, a lot of these things, there's reasons that we see for things existing. It seems like we could just keep going back and back. But let's bring science into it for a second. We know that like matter and energy is neither created nor destroyed, but it also doesn't make sense for it to have just existed. So it's like eventually it had to have started somewhere, but it also seems to be like it can't have been created. So it's like there's got to be that point at which something was started, because there's no way that it could have just infinitely been going, into the past and also into the future.
Right.
Do you have any questions about the causes or anything I've said so far?
I found it interesting when you were talking about the differences in inanimate objects and living things. The living things, essentially, at a certain point, you get to all the way back to where you say, well, they willed themselves into being. They wish to be this thing. It seems to kind of point out the difference between a living being and an inanimate object is that a living being has some semblance of intentionality and purpose that does not exist in inanimate objects.
Yeah, and it's even more than that. It was kind of a case where the idea was if something has life, like the life has this innate property in that it pursues a form. So there is some innate property, say, in what it takes to make a tiger, that it will pursue that.
Yeah.
And this way of thinking, like, obviously there's a lot of flaws with this. It's not entirely correct. There are some things that make a lot of sense, like the whole idea that you've got to have some type of efficient cause. You've got to have something that causes something to exist. We believe in some form even today, but this whole like school of thought has kind of been abandoned now in favor of like what we know with science now. And that also leads to a really important thing to understand when you are reading ancient philosophy, specifically like ancient Greek and like ancient Roman philosophy. Our understanding of science was very limited back then. The Greeks, they were very advanced for the time, but they still had a limited understanding of science compared to what we have today. They didn't have the scientific method. They didn't have anywhere near the kind of knowledge that we have today. And so something that you see a lot of times, you'll have these philosophers who also are scientists, who also do all sorts of other things. And you see them kind of blend together, and you see before science really developed, a lot of times philosophy would fill in the gap of answering these kind of questions that they weren't able to answer with the science that they had at the time, which is really what you see with Aristotle's causes, is he was trying to answer questions about the physical world, which we generally don't use philosophy for anymore. There's still, you can surely have debates, but we tend to try to let science answer the very physical questions. But it's just an important thing to keep in mind when you're reading this kind of philosophy, is they were doing a little bit of both. They were doing philosophy, they were doing science.
Right.
So you definitely see that blending together, and you see where it does kind of cause problems. But
which, that's an important part of this show. We cover news in the worlds of politics, sports, and the paranormal, because I find all of those things interesting, but also I find all of them to have value. And I think that part of what's broken in our society today is because we are so technologically and scientifically advanced, we fail to see, for lack of a better term, the magic or the supernatural, or we fail to be in awe of life itself. And I think that if we were to look at our natural physical world through a more philosophical lens, it kind of provides a richer reality in a way. Kind of supplements what we already know to be true from science. So I kind of see them as working together, not being in opposition.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of people who will immediately discredit philosophy because it's not a science, basically, because it's not something that can be tested. You can do what's called a thought experiment, but that's nowhere near that's nothing similar to what like an actual scientific experiment would be. But just taking like a moment to stop and think about things, think about why you're doing things, think about why something is maybe happening the way that it's happening. Stop and think, why am I thinking this way? Is this correct? And something that helps everybody. Something that I've often said is there are way too many people in the world, and this to me is one of the saddest facts about just people in the world, and I don't want to be one of those people to be about society, but about society. There are so many people who are just going through life, basically going through the motions on autopilot, and they're not taking any moment to step back, for lack of a better word, smell the roses, and just like enjoy the things in life. They don't ever stop and just think about, why is this the way that it is? Why do I feel this way?
Absolutely.
What's the purpose of this? And I don't know, to me it's just a really sad thing to think about, going through your whole life and never once stopping to just question the things around you. So
yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, and I'm sure the answer to this next question could be debated and is multifaceted, but in your opinion and in your perspective in your study, between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, which of those three has most influenced our Western thinking in our world today?
Plato, hands down. There's
more of a Platonic worldview.
There's no, simply for the fact that he was writing it down. You could probably make an argument that Socrates laid a little more foundation, but we wouldn't know what Socrates had been saying if it weren't for Plato. Even if we don't certainly know that Socrates existed, we do pretty sure know that Plato existed. His work, we have more completed versions of his work than, say, Aristotle. We don't have a whole lot of Aristotle. We basically just have notes from his students that they had written. So we don't even have the completed works of Aristotle. We have completed works of Plato. Like, we have the Republic. We have no actual written works of Socrates, just what Plato wrote down.
Yeah.
But Plato, absolutely. And even though I'm not as familiar with Plato, Plato did lay the groundwork for modern philosophy, not for modern philosophy, but laid the groundwork for Western philosophy, and he is the reason that we have like a lot of the foundations that we have.
Well, and I'm no philosopher. I'm a Dollar General philosopher, but I know when it comes to religion, when it comes to politics, when it comes to public servanthood, government, there are certain principles that we espouse, that we have in the West. And so many times those things get traced back to a Platonic worldview and to the teachings and thinking and questions of Plato.
Yes. So, yes, to answer your question, Plato is the most impactful. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of people that who study this stuff that will disagree with that. You could maybe make an argument about the Stoics, who I'm really not familiar with. And I guess you could really say that it wasn't just Plato, it was a lot of Greek philosophy, like the ancient Greek philosophy, because a lot of them built off of each other. A lot of them knew each other, and a lot of them based their works off of each other. So it's really just, Plato is the main person, but it really was just ancient Greek philosophy as a whole.
Very cool, very cool. Interesting stuff, Joshua. Take it from there, take us to our next topic.
So we're going to do just a little more Greek philosophy, but a little more interesting stuff.
Okay.
So maybe you've heard the term of somebody being an Epicurean. Like I don't know if you've heard that term or not.
I have.
Okay. So how do you understand the definition? What do you understand the definition to be?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Well, I've heard of Epicurus. I've heard Epicurean, but I don't have a working definition.
So basically, what it means in like today's world is somebody who enjoys like the luxuries of life. Somebody who like enjoys eating a lot of really good food. Somebody who spends a lot of money. And the origin of that word goes back to this guy in I think it was ancient Greece, named Epicurus. And Epicurus was a philosopher, obviously, and he sat down and decided to figure out what it takes to be happy. Now, what he decided it takes to be, what he came to the conclusion about what it takes to achieve happiness is not anywhere near close to just living in luxury, living with all these fancy things, and it has very little to do with money. We're going to go over this really quick because there's not a whole lot to it, but it's still very interesting. He believed that there were three things that you needed to do in order to achieve true happiness. First thing he believed was that you have to have friends. but not just like the friends that you maybe go hang out with every once in a while. He believed that you needed to like live with your friends. You needed to be roommates with your friends.
Yeah.
He even went so far as to say you really shouldn't even be eating alone. You should always be eating with them. You need to have like, they need to be part of your everyday life. It was important to like have that connection with them, have somebody in your life like that, and they needed to be good friends. They didn't need to be like, you know, the friends that you maybe you're kind of friends with, but they're like a little shady sometimes. You're not really sure how well of a friend they are to you, like somebody that you legitimately love and care about.
He's talking about true community.
Yes, true community. So there was that. The second part that he believed was that you needed to have freedom. But freedom in this case, obviously you probably are not going to be happy like if you are enslaved or something, or if you're like under servitude to somebody. What he meant was you needed to, and I don't mean like have a lot of it, but you needed to have enough money to be able to go and do what you wanted within reason. So, and the reason that I say within reason is maybe you want to like go burn $1 million, but that's not really like a reasonable thing to do. What he meant was just the ability to not have to basically answer to anything, not have to be reliant for your well-being on somebody. So not have to worry about paying any debts or paying, like you have plenty of money to say pay taxes, plenty of money so that you never have to worry about where your next meal is going to come from.
So he was the ancient Dave Ramsey, basically, is what we're saying.
basically. And his final thing, the final ingredient to happiness was an analyzed life. And it's not entirely clear, I don't believe, that he, or what he meant by that. He kind of left it intentionally very broad. The whole idea behind having an analyzed life means you're analyzing why you're doing what you're doing. Kind of like what we just talked about.
Yeah.
You're not going on autopilot. You are taking a step back to think about, hey, why am I doing this? Why am I feeling this way about a certain person? Why am I friends with this person? Why am I spending my money on this instead of this? It was just taking a second to understand yourself and understand like your actions, why you're doing what you're doing, and not just going with the flow of things.
Wow. I got to say that's, I think that recipe for happiness holds a lot of water. To have a sense of community, to be not reliant on others, to have the capacity to have self-awareness and analyze your life and your decision-making and your principles. I mean, I see a lot of value in all of those.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that when you really stop to think about it, it makes a lot of sense. And it seems to be very similar to ideas that we have today, right?
Yeah.
We very much, and we especially saw this like during the pandemic, about how important it was to have community with people, how important it was to have people close to you, besides like in your family, like your own friends, the people that you're close to, and just how bad you're going to feel when you don't have those people around you. The thing about money and the thing about freedom, one of like the things that we kind of attribute that to is like how we talk about not needing to be stressed about money, not needing to be worried, and like how much better you feel when you're able to get into that kind of situation where you don't have to stress and worry about that. And then, the having an analyzed life, maybe we don't think about that as much today as we should, but we could maybe see that in something like the form of the way that we understand mental health now, and like understand counseling and the importance of like understanding what's going on in your head.
Yeah.
So I find this so incredibly fascinating because it's something that is so ancient. This was written before the birth of Christ. Like, that's how old this is. I don't remember when exactly it was written, but thousands of years ago. And yet it seems like it's still something that has relevance to us even today. It's something that we maybe could apply to our own lives.
Oh, absolutely.
To at least be happier,
Yeah, and I mean, even if you take that worldview and that lens, you can apply it to just about any aspect of your life. I've been married for 10, almost 11 years. Apply those three principles to any marriage, okay? You've got to have true and real community with your spouse. You have to make sure that money is not a source of conflict in your marriage. You have to make sure that you're able to provide for each other and your family. And then you have to have clear expectations that are communicated. You have to have self-awareness of your role as a husband or a wife and what you expect of the other. So that's very interesting. Like you say, it was written so long ago, but that lens can be helpful to any aspect of our life that we apply it.
You mentioning the thing about, like, you think about how that could be applied to a marriage. That actually reminds me, we'll take a step back to Aristotle. Aristotle wrote a lot on love, and I'll run over these really quickly. He basically believed that there were, I think it was 3 types of friendships. There were friendships so basically what it means to be friends with somebody and to have like a relationship with somebody. The first one was like a friendship of utility. So it could be something like the friendship you have with your neighbor who lets you borrow the lawnmower and like borrow a can opener. Beneficial to each other.
Yep. My next door neighbor, he's a great dude. He, just this week we had a tree. This is, I live in Alabama. So, we had a tree that had been leaning over since the last hurricane. And it got to the point where, like, this thing could fall, 40, 50-foot tree, could fall any day on our house, our cars. And last Saturday, he's staring at it, and he goes, hey, I could pull that down for you. And, I mean, we live in the city. There's not a lot of room. And I'm like, you could pull it down for me? He's like, yeah, I'll wrap some straps around it and pull it down with my truck. And I'm like, it's not going to fall on my house or my cars? And he's like, nope, I promise. And I trusted him. I was like, okay. And he wrapped the straps around it. He pulled that thing down. It snapped in half. It fell just where he said it would. It was awesome. And that is a friendship of utility right there.
Yeah, and a lot of people, when they read like these whole different types of friendships, they see friendship of utility like being like, I guess, like the first, so not like the strongest friendship, and it immediately gets written off of, oh, you're just using each other. But it's not that. Like, there is a legitimate friendship in there. It's just maybe formed around that utility.
Right.
But anyway, after that, you would then have what's called a friendship of pleasure. The way that we always explained it was, you may have some buddies that you go out and go drinking with on the weekends. You go out to have a good time with. That would be a friendship of pleasure. It would be, you just go out, everybody's happy, everybody feels good. That's the whole purpose of that. But then beyond that, there is, and I can't quite remember the name, but you had like the final level of like a friendship or a relationship. And it was basically like the perfect friendship, the perfect reasons. And basically what it boils down to, it's because you care so much about this person that it wouldn't matter if they were useful to you. It wouldn't matter if they brought you like pleasure, if they made you happy. You like care about them so much that what makes you happy is like seeing them be the best person that they can be and achieving their highest like form, in a sense.
Yeah.
And the easiest way to explain it is kind of like what you would see in a marriage, but it's not specifically that. It doesn't have to be a romantic partner. It could be like, like the friend that you consider your brother. You want nothing but for them to achieve best success they can have and be the best person that they can be.
Well, we have reached this level because that is how I feel about you.
That's how I feel about you, yeah. I remember when we were learning about this, I was trying to wrap my head around all of it because it confused the heck out of me at first. But that was like the way that I remembered. You were the person that I actually thought of when we were learning about this.
We're having a moment. It's very it's very sweet. And I think it does. I mean, I hate to keep bringing it back to a romantic relationship, but even that, you meet somebody and you start studying together for a test. Then you have some things in common, and you go to Dave & Buster's and you play some arcade games and you eat dinner together. And then you get to a point where you have such love and care and admiration for each other that you begin to date exclusively or even get married. So all of these things that you're sharing with us, these principles and thought processes and the way that they fit into our life, I mean, it's something that we put into practice without realizing it throughout our life over and over and over.
Yeah, absolutely. These things, these are things like that we encounter on a daily basis. And I've always found this fascinating. This is pretty much one of the only things I found fascinating about ancient philosophy, is the fact that people were thinking about this and they were able to at least understand this to a degree back then with such a limited understanding of the world around them.
Yeah.
And they were able to realize these things that still seem to hold true today. Now, obviously, there's a lot more complexity with friendships, with relationships, with what it takes to be happy. We know that there's certain chemicals that have to be released in our brain for us to feel happiness. But there was still a limited understanding of that, and there was still, I don't even want to call it limited compared to what we have today, but a great level of understanding for back then.
Absolutely. Well, let me ask you this. We're talking about happiness. Let's flip to the other side of things when it comes to dealing with things that don't make us happy. when it comes to things that disappoint us, things that anger us. What does philosophy have to teach us or have to say to us about how to deal with those moments and parts of life?
So there was actually this one guy named, he had a first name, I can't remember it, I'm not super familiar with the name, but his last name was Seneca. He was a Roman, and I believe he was on the council to an emperor. It may have been Nero, but I can't remember exactly who it was. But he stopped and asked the question about why do we get angry and how do we deal with anger? And it's really simple what he came up with. He believed that we become angry for two reasons. One, something bad happens to us, something that causes us pain or displeasure.
Right.
And in addition to that, it's combined with the fact that we think that we were unjustly given that experience. So that should not have happened to us. And that is what makes us angry about it. A way you can think about this is you may be upset, like if somebody comes up and hits you, you'll get angry about that.
I will.
But you're maybe not going to get angry, say, when you feel the pain of, like, getting a vaccine or something, because it's something that you need, something that you're expecting, something you allowed to happen.
Right.
And the way that he came up with to deal with the anger is to simply expect that anything can happen, any bad thing can happen. Because the main thing that he thought makes us angry isn't even so much that we feel we were unjustly done something. We were surprised by whatever this bad thing was. We weren't expecting it, and that surprise, when we thought it was going to go a certain way, we thought it was going to be a straight line, but in reality there were a bunch of curves in it, and there were a couple dead ends, and that is what makes us angry, is the fact that we were expecting it to go perfectly, and it didn't go perfectly.
Our expectations were violated.
Basically, yeah. We had unrealistic expectations, and when they went wrong, it made us angry.
That's so true. I mean, I think that's. I think Mr. Seneca had a lot of knowledge and wisdom to share with us about that, because we. I think certainly when we're younger, not that injustice doesn't make us upset when we're older, but when we're younger, anytime that we're treated unfairly, it feels and seems like an injustice to us, and it raises that anger in us. As we get older, hopefully some of that mellows out. We can see beyond ourselves. And then a lot of times what makes us the most upset is, like you're saying, when life throws us a curve, when things don't go how we're expecting them to go. So when we do experience that anger, how do we deal with it in a way that's healthy?
Basically, he didn't talk a whole lot about how to deal with it when it happens. His whole idea was to be able to avoid it altogether. Wow. And it was to just, basically, when you make a plan, expect that it's going to go wrong. I don't want to say, like, we're going to go to, like, Murphy's Law of everything that can go wrong will go wrong. But expect as many possibilities as you can come up with. So, like, let's say that you have to drive to work one day, and you have to drive through the city. Expect that you're going to get stuck in traffic. Expect that there's going to be people that drive like idiots on the road that don't know what they're doing.
No turn
expect
signal.
all this. Expect there's going to be road work.
Yep.
Expect you might get pulled over, just so that nothing surprises you.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. And that's pretty much what he wrote. He did mention that it seemed like, and this is not, I'm not making any digs at anybody who may have a lot of money, but he did say that he noticed that a lot of times it was the people with more money than they knew what to do with that would get more mad, because it seemed like they were normally able to buy anything that they wanted. So when there were circumstances out of their control that they couldn't buy things to make it right, that was when they became the most angry, and that they tended to become angrier more than people with less money.
I mean, that makes sense. If you're able to be in control of most all of your life most of the time, that one little thing that's not in your control is infuriating. Whereas a lot of us spend a lot of our lifetime where so much is out of our control that we're forced to learn to go with the flow a little bit more.
Yeah, control is a big thing in people's lives. It's something that everybody has dealt with. It's like in issues with control, and that doesn't even necessarily mean like, the bad ways we think about it, like controlling, like being in a toxic, like controlling situation, but things like just being able to control where our life goes. We like to feel like we have control, and I think it's exactly what Seneca was hitting on. Was we think we're in control because we have this plan, and we have a sense of control as long as it's going to plan. But the second it's out of control, we lose it. That's when we get mad, because we feel like we've lost control.
Yeah. And ironically, there was a quarterback in the early 2000s for Iowa State named Seneca Wallace, and he was best when things were out of control and when he had to scramble around in the pocket. And I think that that's kind of funny. Well, let me ask you this. We're talking about being in control, and one thing that comes up all the time when you're talking about matters of philosophy is the issue of free will. Being American, growing up in our country, something that we put a lot of stock in is being the author of our own destiny, being the one to call the shots, pull yourself up by the bootstrap. I remember when I was in college, I took a class in which we talked about free will and to what degree do we actually have it. What thoughts do you have about that topic?
I am not super I'm not well versed in the questions of free will. That kind of gets into neuroethics and then maybe some philosophy of religion, which I'm pretty familiar with. My best answer is I don't know. Legitimately, I don't know. One of the most important lessons that I learned while taking philosophy classes was from one of my favorite professors. And you would sometimes ask him questions that were these just great questions that stumped everything we had just talked about. And he would just look at you, shrug his shoulders, and say, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to answer the question about free will. I know that in my very limited understanding of neuroscience, there are certain cases where it's like our brain makes a decision before we've actually really thought about it.
Yeah.
We have, say, some involuntary motions or functions in our body. Until you think about it, you breathe automatically. Your heart beats. So there's already some things that we don't really have free will over. We can't just make our heart just stop beating unless we die or something. When it comes to making decisions, we might have free will. We might not. It seems to me that we have free will, and that might be enough evidence that we have because it seems as such. I think, therefore I am. But I don't know if we have free will. It seems to me like we do. I seem to have good reason to think that we have free will because the fact that I can choose to go and do whatever I want. And it seems as such, I have no reason so far to think that I am not in control of my own self, that somebody else is making decisions for me. So it seems to me that we do have free will, but ultimately, I don't know. I could be completely wrong about it. I may not have free will at all.
I mean, I think you're dead on. I think that we do have free will in the grand scheme of things. But I think that we also are influenced a whole lot more than what we realize. And if you want to label that neuroscience, whatever you want to say, I think that the choices that we make, even though they are free, are so heavily influenced on a level that is subconscious that we have free will, but we're heavily influenced anyway. Every decision that we make, and I think a lot of times it just comes down to what we choose as our master. That in any given moment, in any given day, any given decision that we make, in that moment, something is mastering us. It could be fear, it could be anxiety, it could be the desire to make money, it could be an important relationship. But in any moment, we choose a certain master, or we allow something to be master over our decisions. And so even though we do have free will to make those decisions, something is, in a sense, calling the shots too. Does that hold water in your mind?
Yeah, I think we put things at the center of our lives, and that's what controls us, and that's not even always a bad thing. Maybe we put our family at the center of our life. Maybe we put our future, having this goal that we want to achieve that maybe isn't even necessarily revolving around money. But oftentimes we put the wrong thing in there. Maybe we put just making as much money as we can, not making enough money to be able to survive and be comfortable, but just make so much money, hoard it. Our goal is to make a whole lot of money.
Right.
It could be something like, this goes back to sound like we're in high school or something, but being the most popular, having the most friends, going to the most parties, and yeah, it does seem like at that point we're not making our own decisions because we have this negative central thing that influences all of our decisions, like you said. And I think that we see that a lot of times, even kind of getting back from any kind of metaphysical free will, getting into just the way that we're advertised to every single day.
Yeah.
Everything we do, everywhere we look, and that's you see it you know, in a lot of like Western culture, but especially in the United States, everything is advertised. Like, I was pumping gas the other day, and there was a video screen that showed me an ad while I was pumping my gas for some company, some product that I could not care less about. We're bombarded by advertisements every day, and they're designed to override like our common sense.
And they work. They work.
Yeah.
I'm notorious. My wife makes fun of me for how susceptible I am to commercials. I have been in my home and seen a commercial for a new meal at Taco Bell and left the house because it looked good to me and gone and gotten it. And in that moment, am I even really operating under free will, or am I just giving in to what I'm seeing placed before me, you know?
And I guess it depends on, like if that happened to me, I don't think that it would quite be the same, because I just absolutely love Taco Bell. And any new thing that they have, I would love to try. But beyond that, yeah, like, they override our common sense. You take cologne commercials or perfume commercials that you see on TV. You know, they show this, like, super attractive person in, like, in a really nice suit. They're well-dressed. They got a golden watch on. If it's a guy, like, they've got some beautiful woman with them that is just so happy to be with him. And it's like, this is a perfume. I don't think that wearing, like, you know, $100, $150 perfume is going to make you successful. It's not going to do all of these things.
Hey, but it might.
It might, yeah, I suppose.
Also, it might.
Maybe not, but, yeah, we here's, like, another little kind of question I suppose we can ask. It's like, what are we pursuing when we're wanting to buy these things? Like, because we see them on a commercial. Because what these commercials are trying to push at us is, look, you can have a good life if you get this. You can have a good life if you buy this cologne. You can have a good life if you buy this watch or this game system or anything.
This commercial is not selling perfume, really. It's selling you what you see in the commercial. It's selling you the acceptance, and it's selling you the position in society and the level of happiness in your relationship, all the things that you desire. And it's making you believe, even for a moment, that if you have this physical thing, that you can attain all of those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I'll say this is a perfect time to announce that this episode of In the Shed with Wes Anderson is brought to you by Taco Bell Diarrhea.
I've heard a lot of people refer to Taco Bell as Taco Hell, but I personally love Taco Bell.
I still enjoy it, I will say. Well, let me ask you this. Let's dip our toes into the water of relativism, because that is another topic that comes up when any armchair philosopher starts to think about this topic. You start talking about issues of relativity. So take us into that realm. What do you think about relativism? Where does it come from? How does it apply to our world today?
So, let me say one thing. You mentioned relativity. I just don't want there to be any confusion about, like, Einstein's theory of relativity about time, you know, nothing like that. Relativism, when it comes to philosophy, is basically, the answer is a little bit dependent on the person. It's basically a form of subjectivism. You see it with a lot, mainly, and this kind of, I believe, where it originated from, is with something called meta-ethics, and, like, these meta-ethical questions about where does our morality come from, what is the correct system of morality. So basically what meta-ethics is, you have something called normative ethics, and normative ethics are questions like, is X, Y, and Z morally right or wrong? So we won't get into it, but this is just the best example I can think of. It could be a question of, like, is abortion morally right or is it morally wrong? Those are normative ethics.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have meta-ethics, which are questions of, well, like, what does it take to make something wrong? What does it mean for something to be wrong? What system of right and wrong do we have? And relativism is basically an ethical theory, and at its core foundation is this idea that there are certain fundamental disagreements that cannot be resolved. So basically, take one step back, you have what a lot of times when you're referring to relativism in terms of, like, a system of morality, you're referring to what's called cultural relativism, which is a lot of times the relativism, it's the most prevalent relativism that you're going to hear about.
Right.
And it's this idea that say, like, we look at, say, cultures from like 100 years ago, or cultures in other parts of the world. The example that we always used in class was how in some cultures, like in the United States, polygamy is not accepted pretty much anywhere. But in other cultures it is. It's a perfectly normal, accepted thing.
Except for like 13 counties in Utah, but we won't go there.
Over there in Salt Lake City, right?
Yeah.
But the fundamental idea is that both of these cultures are correct. There isn't technically this is not me saying that I think this. This is me saying this is what the theory says.
Good clarification.
There's not an objectively that's for everybody right and wrong about something. It's dependent on the culture from a variety of factors. And the fundamental idea is that there is, at the lowest level, at the fundamental level, there are disagreements between cultures that will never ever be able to be resolved because they stand on such fundamental difference. Like, there's just no way for them to ever come to an agreement.
For example, Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, that could be an example. Relativism would say, well, some cultures agree with Palestine, some cultures agree with Israel. There's no disagreement there's no agreement that can be found between them. There's always going to be that disagreement. There does seem, however, with that, there seems to be an issue of, do we really know where these disagreements are standing? I'm trying to remember who it was that wrote this. But basically what they argued was, if you look, they're actually in agreement about certain things.
Right.
The only example that I can use, and this is not a statement on either side of it, an example is like the abortion argument. And if you actually look at it, the argument, at least with relativism, would be you're not going to be able to have like pro-life and pro-choice ever being on the same side or agreeing about anything. But then if you were to look at it and look at what the argument is, you'd realize, well, both sides would agree that murder is wrong. They just disagree somewhere else. So
right.
There you have the disagreement is not so fundamental like relativism claims it to be. It's just about some other factor of it.
That's interesting. And I think that another example that comes to my mind in our time, and this is starting to be something that more and more folks agree on, but take SeaWorld. I went to SeaWorld as a kid, got splashed by Shamu, had a great time, thought it was awesome, bought some souvenirs. And then as a 20-something year old, I watched the documentary Blackfish. And I learned about how these whales are often brought into captivity, how intelligent they are. They have languages that we cannot understand. Their languages have dialects depending on what part of the sea they're from. Whales grieve when they lose their young. They grow up in family units. And now I have a entirely different view of a place like SeaWorld and of keeping whales that are that intelligent and that remarkable of being in captivity at all, let alone in like 40-foot deep swimming pools, basically. I think 50 years from now, we will look at the fact that we ever did that and go, what was wrong with people? Is that an example of kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, we actually talked about the example that we always use because it was the easiest was like how, say 150 years ago, 150, 200 years ago, slavery was perfectly fine in the eyes of a lot of people. Not many people had a problem with it. Now we look back at it and we're like, what was going on?
Yeah.
And the whole idea is that relativism more serves, because relativism assumes that there is no objective morality. There's nothing that makes something right or wrong. It's all something that maybe, if there is something, it's something that we create. And the whole idea is to explain how you have some of these like things that just seem so insanely wrong to us that are accepted as perfectly fine by other cultures.
Right.
And it's just a bit of an odd. It's just a bit of. I'm not trying to downplay anybody who is a relativist. I'm not trying to take a dig at you, but relativism is really weird. And it's incorrect. I will say that it is incorrect. It's not true.
I mean, there are 60 plus uncontacted tribes in the Amazon today, and in several of those remaining tribes that are uncontacted, a few of them still practice cannibalism, something that to us is absolutely abhorrent. and that we could never fathom and that we think is morally reprehensible, but to them is a way of life. And it's just part of what they do, their culture, their practices. How do you determine if something is moral?
That's a good question that nobody's been able to answer yet. We have our best guesses, like when we create laws and stuff, we try to determine what is right and wrong. We revise laws when certain things are no longer acceptable, like slavery. You know, that used to not be illegal. Now it is. Determining what is right and wrong is such a difficult thing to do. And ultimately, it's not subjective. I don't think morality is subjective.
That was my next question.
Even if morality is non-existent, it's still not subjective. That just means that it just then wouldn't exist, and you just are basically doing whatever you want. An easier question to answer, and the question that we can more easily answer, is why do people have the sense of morality that they have? And it comes from a variety of factors. This kind of plays into some other like theories, some other metaethical theories of morality. There could be a variety of factors of why people feel the way that they feel. You know, and it could explain like why with some cultures cannibalism is okay, because there may be societal influences, your familial relations, like what you do with your family, what you see your family doing. That's maybe how people get their sense of right and wrong. That doesn't mean that if there is an objective morality, like this is wrong, X is wrong, Y is right, that doesn't mean that they're not still like violating this objective morality, but it at least explains why people have this sense of, hey, what I'm doing is right, what I'm doing isn't wrong.
Right.
You know, this is the good thing to do, this is the moral thing to do. But answering a question of what does it take to make something right or wrong is such a complicated question, and depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different answer. You ask somebody who is religious, they may tell you it's because God says, like, you know, it's because like this is what God has set in place. Like that's how we determine what is right or wrong. It completely depends. You could ask somebody who doesn't believe in anything, and they just say, well, there's not any morality at all. We only do what we do to like further our own interest. This is something called interest theory. It's the idea that we do what we do because it helps our interests in some way. It helps better, like further whatever our goals are, whatever our ulterior motive is. You've even got some things called this one theory that I find really interesting called emotivism, and it's the idea that when we say things like stealing is bad, we're not actually saying stealing is bad. We're simply disapproving of stealing. It's this idea that, and it gets really complicated, but it's this idea that there is no concrete, verifiable, testable sense of morality. There's nothing that we can't objectively prove that something is right or wrong. And it's this idea that our morality is shaped by like the way we feel about things. So like if I say murder is wrong, I'm not saying that I'm not like asserting that murder is wrong. What I'm actually doing is making an expression that I disapprove of murder. Yeah, basically, to make a long rant short, it's not really clear what it takes to make something right or wrong. People have their own sense of what makes something right or wrong. So, like I said, you take somebody who's religious, right is what God said is right, wrong is what God said is wrong. You take somebody like egalitarians with egalitarianism. The whole idea is that you are maximizing like happiness. It really just depends. There's a really interesting thing about the fact that it seems like ethics is a like metaphysical, basically non-physical thing. It's something that does seem to exist, but it doesn't exist in any physical form. Because of that, there doesn't seem to be any way that we can certainly know of anything that is true of morality because of its non-physical characteristic. And so we're kind of left at a point of we can't really tell what makes something right or wrong. If we're looking at a specific issue, we can maybe see the point, like the specific point that makes that specific thing become morally wrong, but we can't actually talk about what the quality of something to be wrong is, like what it means to be good or what it means to be bad. We just know when things are good or when things are bad.
And it's interesting because, you know, a whole host of people in our world today will tell you that morality is completely subjective. And yet, take something like the Ten Commandments. You pulled those out that were a part of what a lot of people consider to be Holy Scripture. Whether you are an atheist or an ardent believer in Christianity, you can still agree that most of those things are true and are good principles. Don't lie. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness against your neighbor. Don't commit adultery. Don't worship things that aren't worthy of your worship. These are all things that most of us, no matter our upbringing, can say, hey, there's value there. There's truth there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads into some other some arguments for objective morality. So when it comes to talking about like whether or not morality is objective, there's what's called realism and anti-realism. Realism is that there are true moral facts, and moral facts just simply being something's right, something's wrong. And then anti-realism would be none of this is real. There's something there, but it's something that we've created. It's not something that's objective. So that's actually one of the arguments for realism, for objectivism, is that there's certain things that it seems like everybody can agree on. Everybody can agree on some form that murder is wrong. They may disagree what constitutes murder.
Mm-hmm.
They may disagree about just how wrong murder is. But ultimately, there seems to be. You go ask anybody, killing is wrong in some form. They'll believe that. They'll believe some form of killing is wrong.
Right.
And there's a lot of different explanations for that. There's religious explanations, there's societal explanations, it's really fascinating to me, there's even evolutionary explanations that basically was meant to further our species' existence, and that's why we created the sense of morality that we have. And it's weird how it works, because it said there wasn't any morality until humans existed, which is a weird approach. But the point of this is, there are a lot of things that we can all agree on in some form, even if we disagree.
For sure. And it sounds to me like overall, in addressing the question, is morality subjective, you would say largely no.
No, I can say that with almost certainty, simply just kind of I don't want to get into the logic of it, but it seems to me that morality couldn't be subjective, because for it to be subjective, it wouldn't have to be real. And if morality is not real, then there seems to be no way you can get to subjectivism. You can't. If there's nothing there, then it's not dependent on you. It's not dependent on anything. It's just not there.
There's no there.
Subjectivism fails at that point.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, Joshua. Is there any such thing as truth?
It depends on what you're talking about. There are certain things that we can experience within the physical world that seem to be true. There's it really depends. If you want to ask me, does the earth exist, I think there's truth about that. Now, which we'll get into a little later, there's a question of, do we know about the truth, and are we reasonable for thinking that this is the truth? It could be that the truth exists somewhere and we're over here independent of it, but it seems to me that there are truths that exist. Whether or not we can know them, it doesn't make any sense for anything to exist in our physical world and not be true. Even if all of what we're seeing is an illusion, there's still a truth in there. We're seeing an illusion. So I think that there is truth. Now, what there's truth about, there's questions that are really hard to answer, like truths about morality. But I think that there are some truths that do exist in the world, that are fundamental. You can't take away. No matter who you are, this thing is true. So,
well, let's get into this then. How can we really know anything? How do we really know that we exist? How do we really know that what we're seeing is actual? How do we know that anything actually is even real?
So everybody's probably heard this name at some point. Descartes. They've probably heard that name at some point. Descartes came up with this problem that's usually called the evil demon problem. It's not religious anyway. It's not demonic in any way. It's just an example.
Sorcerer.
But the more fun way to think about it is what I've heard called the brain in the vat problem. And it's basically a logic problem. It's part of something that's called epistemology. And epistemology is study of what we know. So if you have like philosophy, that's just like the study of knowledge, the love of knowledge. Epistemology is asking the questions of, yeah, but how do we know that? You know, are we justified in knowing that? And so the question about a brain in a vat, or Descartes' evil demon, is the idea that imagine and assume that we are a brain in a vat. We are a brain in a vat that is connected to, say, like wires or something, that gives us stimuli, that gives us the perception that we are a completed human being who has experiences, who experiences the earth, experiences the whole universe that we have. And so we have like all these experiences. How can we be certain that we're not a brain in a vat? So like take you and me right now. How do we know that we're not two brains in a vat that are being stimulated to think that, or to believe that we're having this conversation for in the shed right now?
I don't know.
How do you even know that I'm real and that I'm not just some stimuli that is being given to your brain that's in a vat?
I feel stimulated.
So, yeah, it's a question of how can we seem to know, because the problem lies in the fact that any reason that you're going to try to come up with as of why you are, you know, why you're an actual person and why you're not in a brain in a vat could be that you're only being deceived into thinking that by the stimuli you're being given. Wow. And there's a lot of different responses. When you get into epistemological questions, one of the things that you're always going to see is you're going to always have a skeptical answer to it, which is basically just to give up and say, we don't know. We have no way of knowing if we're a brain in a vat. But then you have like actual responses, because we don't ever, if we're trying to pursue what is right, if we're trying to figure out what is true, we don't ever want to just give up and say, well, we don't know. Now, it could very well be that after investigating it, we find out, hey, there is legitimately no way of knowing. But there's a difference between actually investigating it to figure out what is true and just hearing the issue and saying, yeah, we don't know. So it's a little tricky to kind of separate that. But one of the responses, this is the one that I loved. We did this in class. Basically, you can look in front of you and see that you have hands. You can look in front of you and see that your hands are real. And it seems that there is no reason to think that you are a brain in a vat. It seems rather unreasonable to think that you are a brain in a vat, given all the experiences that you have and given the unlikeliness of that occurring. Therefore, because you have hands, because it is unreasonable to think otherwise, you are not a brain in a vat.
What role, Joshua, does reason and logic play when it comes to philosophy? Do we have to consider when we're thinking about these philosophical matters whether something is reasonable or logical, or are there times that our philosophical thinking takes us beyond what is reasonable?
I mean, reason and logic is something that should always be playing a vital role in when you're thinking. You should always be, if something's illogical, if like, basically if you have one thing that says X, and one thing that, or you have to say the one thing that says X equals 1, one thing that says X equals 2, you should stop and think, hey, there's a contradiction there, something's not right there. You also always want to have like good reason for believing what you believe. It should be an integral part of pretty much anything that you encounter. You should always be thinking about, does this make sense? Is this contradictory? When it comes to things like what you believe, a lot of people, and this can be a wide variety of simple things. It can be things like why you believe you should do something. You should be asking yourself, do I hold this belief for a good reason? Meaning, like, basically, are you rational for thinking that this is true? So, like, am I rational for thinking that the sky is blue? And you just want to, like, make sure that your reasons are sound, that you have a good reason to believe something. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And it makes me think about Occam's razor, the idea or principle that essentially the most simple explanation is often the one that is correct. Do you put any stock in that?
It really depends, because there are some questions. there's this one concept in this class that I took of something about how do we deal with something called familial obligations. And it's basically just like, hey, once you're grown up, what do you owe your parents? And the solutions that we have for that are incredibly complex. There's a really simple solution in that you don't owe them anything, but that doesn't seem like the best explanation. But that is nonetheless the simplest explanation you're going to get for that problem.
Yeah.
If we take a step back to like the brain in the vat question, the simplest answer is that we can't know if we're a brain in a vat, but that really doesn't seem like the correct answer. So I think that I think it's dependent. I don't think there's anything like, I don't think there's some property of truth or some property of existence where simpler is better in terms of finding a solution. I think it just sometimes happens that way.
Yeah. And, you know, I don't think that I am a brain in a vat. But when I go to Walmart, I feel like there are a lot of brain in a vats at Walmart.
Yeah, I feel that way a lot of times too. It's just, it's like, are you thinking about what you're doing?
Well, this kind of dovetails into one of my favorite topics, or thought experiments, if you will, simulation theory. What do you make of simulation theory? Do you think that it has any basis in reality? Is it complete nonsense?
Well, from what I understand about simulation theory, it's actually very similar to the brain in a vat, in the sense that if there is the simulation, it would seem that it could be programmed in such a way that we could never know.
Right.
One of the ways that I've always tried to explain this was, so you have simulation theory, you have the idea that our whole universe, you know, it isn't actually real. It's all being simulated on something like some kind of computer, something like a computer. The way I'd always thought about it is, it could be, I don't think this is true, but it could be that there is some very fundamental truth that is right in front of our eyes, that if we saw it, we would immediately know that we were in a simulation. But we have been programmed in such a way that we are completely blind to that, you know? I think it's interesting. Again, I get to the idea of it seems so unreasonable that the fact of how unreasonable it seems to give us good reason to think that it's not true. I've heard some scientific explanations for it. It basically goes something like, so take like a video game, for example. You have like the frame rate that a video game plays at. So usually it's like 60 frames per second, right?
Yeah.
And so then the whole scientific explanation is that you have the certain speed that light goes, you know, there's nothing that can exceed the speed of light. And so the whole idea is like, that's basically kind of like the universe's frame rate. Now, that still seems unreasonable to me. When you get into simulation theory, you start getting into the questions of free will. And you could make an argument that like, maybe you're just AI, you know, like AI in a video game. But at the end of the day, all that AI is a series of coding that can only go a certain number of ways, right? Like it's not infinite, like seemingly our decision-making capabilities are, in that we can make a decision about anything, like whatever you give us, we can make a decision about. So it seems to me that simulation theory is not true. It sounds really cool. It's really cool to think about. I think it's a good thing to think about, but ultimately I don't think it's true.
It certainly is something interesting to think about. I don't necessarily believe it or put stock into it yet. I have read even professors from Ivy League schools that project it as a possibility, and who a lot of the same lines that you just discussed when it comes to artificial intelligence, when it comes to the fact that even our genetic makeup is, in sense, a coding. And so when it comes down to it, we're all zeros and ones replicated in a certain pattern, and that it may be possible for us to exist in the way that we do, where we are unaware of who's pulling the strings, of what's making us do what we do. So it's a fun thought experiment. I don't think that's reality. I don't want it to be reality. I am terrified of AI. More so than I am a zombie apocalypse or an alien invasion. AI is what terrifies me the most.
Yeah, I understand that. There's the whole idea of the singularity. the whole idea of the point at which artificial intelligence, whether it's like a robot or like a computer program, becomes as smart or smarter than humans. We start getting into questions of, we kind of get back into questions of free will. We get into questions of consciousness. What does it mean to be conscious? Is it just a brain process, or is it something more? Like, is it something spiritual, or is there some like basically infinite, indivisible quality of us that is our consciousness? AI is a bit terrifying. You see like the stuff you have with like Chat GPT now. You see things like with I don't know if you've heard any of them. Like there's like the voice audio AI that can create the voice of somebody if it listens to enough clips of them and can mimic their voice perfectly.
Yep.
It's really fascinating to me. There's a lot of ethical questions relating to AI that aren't even like really deep questions. Like we've had to answer. Took a class called Education and Justice, and we talked a little bit about like some of the implications of AI, like in terms of it being used for cheating or it being used for like learning. And AI is either going to be the greatest invention that we've invented up until this point, or it's going to be the worst invention.
Yeah.
And not even in terms of it being some like, Armageddon event. And not even like that. Even if it's just something like AI is used to create everything, it puts a bunch of people out of work. It diminishes the value of art because we're taking just a computer-generated, picture and considering it art. Whether it affects literature, about what does it take for something to be good? Does it have to be made by a human, or can it be something made by a computer? And it's really fascinating. It's really terrifying, but at the same time, I think it's also really interesting.
It is.
Because of the ways that it can positively impact our life. I mean, it's something that we're just going to have to see. The big question everybody asks about AI is, like, is it going to take over the world? Is it going to destroy everybody? And I don't have an answer to that because I don't really know enough about it.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of people say, like, I know that Stephen Hawking talked a lot about, AI is going to destroy the world. Like, that will be that'll destroy humans. That'll be the downfall of humans. I've heard other people say maybe that's true, but that is a long, long, long ways away.
Well, and maybe it is, maybe it's not. I don't know that we want to talk about Stephen Hawking after the Epstein papers have come out in the last couple of days.
That is true. I forgot about that.
But something interesting is that we're already seeing AI show up in the ways that you're describing in our world today. Just in the last several weeks, the guy that was in charge at Sports Illustrated was let go of his job because it came to light that he was using AI to populate and write a majority of the articles that they were putting out. And apparently that was a secret. People didn't know he was doing it, and it came out that he was, and he was relieved of his duties because he was using that rather than employing people to write those articles. And so that brings into light some of the things that you're talking about and the ethical questions. And it's really just an issue of what are we going to do with AI? At what point are we going to kind of put rules and regulations into place before it kind of runs amok and we're no longer in control?
Yeah, and I think it's already kind of running amok. Because the thing, like you said about, I hadn't heard about the Sports Illustrated guy, but that doesn't surprise me one bit. It's a question of, like, are we going to get to a point, and we're kind of already at that point, of how can we distinguish real things from something that's artificially created?
Deep fakes.
Yeah, deep fakes. That's been a thing that Russia has used against Ukraine. I think I actually mentioned that in our last episode.
I think
they
you did.
Were creating fake videos of Zelensky basically announcing a retreat and a surrender.
Yeah,
And
episode.
It's really, some of those things are like really, really scary. There's a question about, are we going to get to a point one day where the AI controls our military? And will we have entire wars fought by AI?
Gosh. Shout out to episode 54, the emergency podcast where we talked about Vladimir Putin the last time we had you on the show. It was a great episode. And, you know, I don't know. I just think that some of the things I learned about AI just blows my mind. I heard the other day, you know, that thing that pops up when you're online where you have to prove you're not a robot by picking things out of a picture. You know, how many of these pictures contain a car or a bicycle or a light or whatever. And AI has learned how to beat that system by claiming to be a vision-impaired person. And I read that, and I just sat with it for a few moments, and it just terrified me.
Yeah, and that actually, it raises questions about, look at the cost it's coming to people, especially people who are a little more vulnerable. So like somebody who's visually impaired, this cost is now, it's not on like the people who wouldn't need that mode. It's on the people who are already in need of assistance about it. And that is a huge ethical red flag. Like that is a really big deal. And it maybe doesn't seem like such a big deal, you know, when it comes to like passing the Am I a Robot test, but the implications of another example about this, I mentioned ChatGPT. When I was in, it was my second to last semester, was when ChatGPT really started gaining traction. So much so that all of our work had to be run through an AI checker.
Wow.
I one day posted a discussion post about something for one of my philosophy classes, and the system, even though I had not used AI, flagged it as possibly being AI generated.
Wow.
Now, I didn't face any issue. I knew that professor really well, and I told her about it, and she said, yeah, I know you wouldn't cheat. Like, you have no reason to, especially on something like this. But it meant that I had to go back, reword a lot of my stuff, and resubmit it. And then, obviously, that's not a big deal. It took me maybe 5 minutes to fix it. But it was really unfair to me when you think about it, the fact that there were people who were cheating, who, because of that, because of what they did wrong, I then had to face a consequence of it.
Right.
Obviously, that is not a significant thing. It affected me absolutely in no way. But
the larger implications on society.
Larger implications of we're making undeserving people do certain things because of AI. So like the case of the it's affecting the people who are visually impaired and need that visually impaired mode. It's going to cause a lot of issues.
And so
just kind of what happens.
And so the greater lesson of the episode tonight is robots are taking over. It's already happening, and we have no hope. If you learn nothing else tonight, I'm being facetious. Well, Joshua, we've covered a lot of topics. What else do you have for us that you see important in the world of philosophy to our world today?
So one of the last things that I kind of want to talk about, we'll go back a little bit to epistemology and what I was talking about. How can we know what we know? So when you study epistemology, there is one question, one problem that really you have to address before you can even begin doing epistemology. Epistemology, like I said, is the study of how we know what we know. It is the question of how, what do we know, how do we know what we know? And it's called the problem of the criterion. It was, it actually goes way back, I think actually to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but it didn't really become like spotlighted in contemporary philosophy until I think it was 1973. There was this guy, Roderick Chisholm, who brought the problem of the criterion back, published it, and now it's a huge problem that there's not a solution to so far. So it's basically two questions. What do we know? So like, you know, what things do we know? And then how can we know that we know? And at first it may not seem like that is a really complicated thing, but one of the things that he pointed out is it seems like in order to answer what we know, we have to know how we know what we know. But it seems like to know how we know what we know, we have to at least know some things. So basically, if you consider like them being questions A and B, you can't answer question A without answering question B, and you can't seem to answer question B without answering question A.
It's a paradox.
It's kind of a paradox. The point of this is one of the important points. Have you ever heard on the news somebody talking about like, oh, this begs the question, right?
Right.
Let me tell you right now that if you say beg the question like that to any philosopher, you're going to annoy the heck out of them. Anybody who studied philosophy, because usually what, at least beg the question, like, or begging the question originates from philosophy. And what it originally means is making an unfair assumption to then, like, basically provide an answer. And that's kind of like one of the central parts of the problem of the criterion. It's how do we avoid making these assumptions in order to get to an answer? Because there are three I guess you could say, traditional responses to the problem of the criterion, at least that Roger Chisholm laid out. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot beyond that. There are definitely some other answers. I've actually written on the other answers. But you have 3 ways to respond to this problem. There's something called particularism. There's something called Methodism. Not the Methodism like the Christian denomination. It's not like John Wesley's Methodism.
That's too bad.
And then you have skepticism. Particularism deals with making an assumption about what we know to then answer a question of how we can know that we know it. Methodism basically goes the other way around. It starts with assuming basically a method, assuming a way to know what we know, to determine things, like to determine the specifics of what we know. So are you following so far?
I think so. Can you give me a real-world example to flesh it out?
So, like, what we know, we might know that the sky is blue, right?
Right.
And then how we know what we know, it would basically just be how we know that the sky is blue, how we know that that is true. One of the problems is you have to have justification to basically to believe, like, something. So, like, you have some form of justification. Like, you may believe that the sky is blue because you looked out and saw it, right?
Right.
But then it's, you could then also ask the question of, well, how do I know that, like, I'm sorry for this. How do I know that I'm not colorblind?
Personal.
And then you go so far, like, how do I know that my eyes are working perfectly? How do we know that we have eyes? How do we know, like, that's what like, vision is what they're meant to do? How do we know all these things? And it seems that for every belief you have, there is some other belief that you have to already know to be able to believe it. And so then we just seem to be, like, on this, like, basically infinite regress back of, okay, we're basing all these beliefs on other things. And that's something called, like, circularity. Or it eventually leads to circularity, which is basically it's true because of this, like, because of this other idea, and this other idea is true because of this other idea.
For example, we know we did not visit the moon, and
I thought we settled this the first time I was on.
Yeah, we did. Okay, so you have to answer B sometimes in order to get to question A, is where we're at.
You have to answer question B to get to question A, but in order to answer question B, you have to answer question A, basically.
That's deep.
Yeah. And basically, like, another way to think about this problem is, in order for us to have, like, good beliefs about something, there's this whole idea in philosophy, and it has its issues. It's called a justified true belief. It's this idea that you have good reason for thinking this is true, the fact that it is true, and the fact that you actually believe it. And so the important part there is the justification. And you have to have justification to believe either A or B, but it doesn't seem you can get the justification you can't get justification for A without justification for B, but the justification for B is not possible without A.
Wow.
And then the 3 solutions that I mentioned, particularism, Methodism, and skepticism, attempt in some form to answer that. Particularism, like I said, assumes an answer to A and then uses those assumptions to then develop a method. Methodism assumes the method, assumes, like, the how we know it to figure out what we know. And then skepticism is basically just like, there's no answer. There's no way to figure this out. We're stuck. We can't truly know anything at all.
Which is not a fun place to be.
No. It might be acceptable if we investigate it and find that out. The important point about, we'll kind of just set skepticism to the side for a second, because you don't ever want to be a skeptic, really. The issues with particularism and Methodism is they are question begging. So basically what they're doing is they're making assumptions that are unfounded, that are unreasonable, that may have no place being made to then answer a question. One of the problems with particularism is that what if we assume what we know, like, what if we assume something incorrect for what we know? Well, then we are going to form an incorrect, because we'll basically form an incorrect answer to B based on our baseless assumption for A. And it goes the other way around. If we assume an incorrect method, we might get completely wrong things about what we actually know. the guy that I was talking about that came up with these, Chisholm, he basically he didn't think that any of the answers were good. He thought that Methodism was probably the better answer, but he really did not make, in my opinion, a good case for it. It's really interesting because there seems to be another way to answer these questions beyond just what he came up with.
Okay.
And it uses something called reflective equilibrium. You maybe have heard that term, you maybe haven't.
I've heard equilibrium, but not reflective.
Okay. So reflective equilibrium is something that you've maybe considered even if you didn't know that term. It's the idea of when your beliefs or your morals, it comes from like normative ethics. So it comes from like when your like morals, when your beliefs about certain like ethical questions all align with each other and all like they don't contradict each other.
Okay.
And so when it's applied to the problem of the criterion, it looks something like you don't assume anything. There's no assumptions being made, but you look at what seems to be true. Not what you don't make any assumptions that it is true. It's just like, well, like the sky looks blue to me. And so then you use reflective equilibrium to compare that with other things that seem to be true until you can basically narrow it down, make sure they're not contradicting each other, to at least determine, well, these things are true because they're not contradicting with other things that seem to be true. You just use that to figure out what you know, and that basically functions as the answer to question B of how we know what we know. Like, this is kind of how we know what we know.
Process of elimination.
Assumptions about these things being true, but you use a system of, hey, these things seem to be true, let's figure out if they are, basically.
It's just a process of elimination. Interesting.
Kind of like that, yeah. And it's one of the really interesting things that somebody wrote about about using this like system is you very well could use the system and actually come to a skeptical solution. You could do this and figure out, hey, there isn't an answer to question A or B that you like. There's an answer to question A and B that is independent of each other, and that we truly can't know anything. But you're also not making any assumptions.
You've gotten there. You've gotten to that point without making assumptions by just going through the entire process first.
Right. And it still has its problems. It still has, you're basically trading question begging and like the assumptions for circular arguments in the sense that you are saying, well, we're going to use a reflective equilibrium. This seems to be a good method. Why is this a good method? Well, you have to apply reflective equilibrium to it for it to make sense. So it basically is like crediting itself. But it doesn't. It's not entirely clear why, in this case, it's a bad thing. Because if it turns out that reflective equilibrium is actually the correct way of going about this to figure out what we know, then it kind of all works out. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's very interesting and thought provoking. You say in this whole discussion to set skepticism aside, and that you don't want to be a skeptic, which I find to be interesting that you made that comment, because that's something that is seen in our worldview today largely as being a positive, that you should approach everything with skepticism. So explain a little bit more why you made that comment and what you mean.
Skepticism isn't the way to go because you always want to be trying to figure out something. You don't ever want to just give up. You know, even if you hit a dead end of trying to figure out what is true, you don't want to just stop and like say, oh, there must not be an answer. Because that's one of the problems with skepticism. Skepticism isn't even just giving up on trying to figure it out. It's coming to the conclusion that there is not an answer.
Gotcha.
And it's usually unfounded. One of the problems of it relating to the problem of the criterion is skepticism basically says, hey, you can't figure out A or B without making one of these assumptions. But in doing that, skepticism actually makes the assumption that there is no right answer. That is seemingly unfounded, because there doesn't seem any reason to think that there isn't an answer.
So really it's more about being and protecting a sense of intellectual curiosity.
I suppose you could put it that way. It's just, it's going to benefit you to not be a skeptic in that sense. Now, you know, you may hear being a skeptic about like a certain theory or something. I don't mean like that. If you have good reason to think that, you're really not a skeptic. You just don't believe a specific thing. Right. Being a skeptic is coming to the conclusion that there just is no answer about something, basically.
So Joshua, one thing that I hear about, you know, you mentioned that we might hear people say a lot of times, well, that begs the question. Another thing that I hear a lot of time is that people describe themselves as being cynical or being a cynic. What does that actually mean from a philosophical standpoint to be a cynic?
I haven't really studied cynicism that much. I've seen it in passing. From my understanding of it, it's basically just like that you have a negative outlook of a lot of things and you expect. It's not cynical in the sense of like what we talked about dealing with anger of like expecting the worst, but it's that you expect nothing good out of anything. An example, some people consider like having a nihilistic view of the world or of morality as being cynical. Like you're just, you're expecting the worst. You're not surprised. You almost, in a sense, find joy in the fact that you were right about how wrong it was.
Right.
And how bad it went. But I'm not super knowledgeable in cynicism, so what I'm saying could all be completely wrong, but that is my understanding of it from what I've heard.
Well, Joshua, we've covered a breadth of topics. To close out the show, I thought that being that we were going to talk about philosophy, I just did a little Googling, and I pulled up something that is philosophical questions for dummies. Because, when it comes to philosophy, I am a dummy. And so I have 3 questions that I would like to just pose to you, someone who is a little bit more studied and learned, and just hear your take on these questions. Are you game?
I'm game, absolutely.
All right, the first one is the first question of philosophical debate for dummies. Do memories still exist if you forget them?
That's actually an epistemological question. And we studied this in class, and I can't quite remember it. It's a question of, do we still have evidence of stuff if we forget about it? Like, do we still have a reason to think it? Do memories still exist if we forget about them? Well, considering that a memory is, the entire memory is knowing about something that happened in the past, I think if you forget about it and you have no way of recalling it in any form, then it no longer exists. Now, if it is somewhere there tucked in your brain, that you can maybe recall somehow, even if you can't recall it, if it's still there somewhere in your brain, it's just suppressed, I still think it exists. But once it's no longer in your brain, I don't think it would exist and in that case, if you've forgotten it.
Yeah, and that makes sense. There are such a thing as suppressed memories, but if you no longer remembered it at all, it would cease to be a memory, I would think, and would no longer exist, maybe. The second question, a philosophical debate for dummies, are animals freer than man? What say you, Joshua Bartholomew Teasley Jr. III?
Are animals freer than man? That depends on what you define as free. They're free from a lot of the stress that we have because they don't have the same complex brains as us. They're not free in the sense that they can't do the same things that we can do, It really depends. It depends on what your sense of free is. I don't even think this is a question so much about whether animals are free. It's about what does it mean to be free? Does it mean physically free and that you're able to go anywhere that you want? Does it mean free in the sense that, you don't have anything that you worry about? Your life is entirely full of pleasure and completely lacking anything negative, lacking any kind of suffering or anything. It really depends on what your definition of free is.
Right. And I'm going to say that squirrels don't have to pay bills.
They don't.
That's my layman's response to that, is that a squirrel does not have to pay bills. Okay. Question number 3: how do we know that we are not dreaming right now?
Again, this kind of gets back to the brain in a vat question. How do we know? Because it seems like we're not. It seems completely unreasonable to think that we are that we are in a dream. I have no way of proving that, I suppose, but it seems unreasonable to think that we are in a dream.
I would agree, and it's interesting that those 3 questions, philosophical questions for dummies, all pertain to things into larger topics that we've already discussed. So all of this kind of goes together. It's a tapestry, and
absolutely.
We're not the first ones to have this discussion or these thoughts.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that when you study do philosophy classes is you start to realize hey, all of these things are connected. I took a social and political class. It was actually my first philosophy class, and the one way that we wrapped up everything was basically by looking back and seeing hey, all of these issues are related in some form. And when you get an answer to one question, you then are going to have a follow-up. Like, hey, what are the implications for this? And it applies. A lot of these things are all connected, in ways that you probably wouldn't expect. You could ask the question about, are animals free, and relate that back to, hey, is it okay to eat meat? Is it okay to test on animals? It's really fascinating.
And I'm going to say yes and no, because a steak is very good, but I don't want anybody testing on animals, at least not in the way that we normally think of.
And there's some really good literature on this by a guy named, and this is not an endorsement of him, but there's some really good writing on this by a guy named Peter Singer about the rights. I believe the paper's called What We Owe Animals. Really fascinating paper that's really, really hard to debate and really, really hard to refute. And he makes really solid arguments, and when you actually read it, you're like, oh, yeah, like, this makes a lot of sense. This doesn't mean that I'm a vegan, but it's a really interesting paper, and I agree, like, the way we test on animals is very wrong.
Absolutely. Well, when it comes to modern philosophy, who are some writers, some thinkers, some folks that you would point our audience to, that you would say, if you want to dip your toe into the water of philosophy from a modern worldview, who are some folks that we should look up and do some reading of?
It really depends on what type of philosophy you're wanting to do. If you're going to do like a social and political philosophy, I'm going to say go read Karl Marx, go read Nozick, go read John Rawls. John Rawls especially. If you're wanting to, like, read questions like about, like, bioethics, like what rights do we have about our body, I'm going to tell you, go read Judith Thompson, go read Don Marquis. It really depends. It depends on what you want to read. And I couldn't give you a short list of, if you want to get just like a broad sense of philosophy, what to read, because it's only going to be about, like, a specific topic. There's so many different people, and if you start, like, looking into it, you'll find, like, what the really good work is. It just depends on, like, what topic you want to read. Your best bet is to just find like a branch of philosophy that interests you. Find a topic or a question that interests you, and get to work just learning about it.
Yeah.
And you'll figure out which ones are good and bad.
Yeah, and I'm gonna say maybe watch George Carlin do some comedy. I think that comedy at its best is very philosophical. What the best comedians do is they make light of our existence and the problems that we face, the questions that we ask in our everyday life, and in so doing, they paint a broad picture of society. And he was one of the best at it. And I just think it's interesting that those two things go together so seamlessly.
I agree. It makes it accessible to people. It makes it interesting. Because sometimes you read some philosophy and it is just so boring, so dry, you dread the whole thing. But yeah, I would agree with you.
So last question, Joshua, and this is more of a little bit of a stretch when it comes to talking philosophy necessarily. But I happen to think this is the greatest icebreaker question of all time, and I wanted to get your take on it.
Yeah, go for it.
So imagine this with me, Joshua Bartholomew Teasley Jr. III. You're in an open field, okay, and you get to choose from the following list, 3 of the following to defend your life, and the ones that you don't pick are coming after you to hunt you down and to do harm to you and to take your life.
That will influence my answers, most likely.
There is 1 hunter with a shotgun, 1 rhino, 2 brown bears, 3 lions, 4 gorillas, 7 Cape buffalo, 10 crocodiles, 15 wolves, 50 hawks, and 10,000 rats. You get to choose from that list 3 things to defend your life, and the rest are coming at you. What are you choosing?
I think the 3 things that I'm going to have defend me, the first one, I'm definitely going to pick the hunter with the shotgun.
Okay.
Because that could at least help with, like, if something gets too close to me, if I can't outrun something. I would probably then pick the Cape buffalo, because those things are literally a giant wall of beef.
True.
They're called the Black Death in Africa, and they're called the Black Death, and they're called the Widowmaker, because they are that dangerous, and they are aggressive, and they are strong. Like, they are super dangerous. I think I would honestly also pick how many rats was it?
10,000 rats.
Yeah, I feel like that, even with something like going at something big like a rhino, I feel like it's still going to be able to cause enough distraction and be able to do something if they had like a horde mentality, like basically like a bunch of zombies or something. I feel like they could do some damage.
So you're taking...
I certainly wouldn't want 10,000 rats going against me.
Well, that's true. So you're taking the hunter with the shotgun, the 7 Cape buffalo, and the 10,000 rats.
Yeah, I think so.
And what order are you placing these beasts to defend you?
I think at the front lines will be, like, surrounding everything will be the rats, right? And then you'll have the buffalo make, like, a giant wall of beef to protect us, and then in the hunter behind all of that in case anything manages to get through. Because I feel pretty confident about a hunter being able to deal with, like, brown bears or lions or maybe even the rhino. The rhino you can probably dodge because they have really terrible eyesight.
I hope that is a strong shotgun, though. I mean, if he has a 410, we are in trouble.
Yeah, that wouldn't be good.
I don't know. I think I would go with the hunter with the shotgun and the 10,000 rats. We agree there. But I think my third, I'm going to go with the 50 hawks. I think those 50 hawks up in the sky, you know, do the chickens have large talons situation, you know, they're swooping down and they're pecking eyes and they're scratching faces. I'm gonna surround myself with the rats. The hawks will be up in the sky and the hunter will be right in front of me with the shotgun.
I think that sounds like a pretty solid plan, honestly. I'm still gonna stick with my buffalo, but
in my plan, I'm a little bit worried about the buffalo. I'm a little bit worried about the brown bears and the lions. I don't know. That to me, that is I think about this question far more than is healthy.
Well, it's better to be thinking about that than not thinking about anything at all.
Absolutely. Well, Joshua, I've so enjoyed having you on the show again. You are the only person to be on the show a record 4 times now. We have talked about all kinds of philosophical matters. Thank you for being here with us tonight. Thank you for stretching our minds. Thank you for helping us to think about things in a different way. Are there any shout-outs you want to give, any way that we can follow you on social media?
I appreciate coming on here. I love getting to talk about this stuff, and it's always fun to talk about philosophy, and it's a good thing to talk about philosophy. It's one of the things that I'm really passionate about, and anytime I can, you know, just sit around and rant for like 2 hours just talking about all sorts of stuff that interests me about philosophy, you know, it's always a good time, and these kind of conversations are good to have. Like I said, my whole purpose of doing this is to get people to think. I didn't do this to convince you of any particular thing to be true. I do want you to think about like why you believe what you believe. Think about critically about like the things that you encounter, because it's very cliche, but like our world will be a better place when people actually stop and think. When people start thinking, we'll be in better shape. Yeah,
and I think there's tremendous value in that. You always come prepared. You always come correct. We always have a good time. Thank you for being on the show tonight, Joshua.
Thank you for having me.
That's all for this week. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. I can't either. It's back in the house and out of the shed for me. Thanks again for listening to episode 71. Make sure to subscribe, like, share, and review. It really does help. If you have any paranormal experiences, opinions about sports or politics that you'd like to share, you can email the show at intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. Again, that's intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. I might even read it on air. Join our membership club at patreon.com/intheshed4. Look for us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Pandora, the Good Pods app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to follow us on X at InTheShed4. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at In the Shed with Wes Anderson 6670. We sure would appreciate it. Tune in again next week when we hit the headlines, talk some sports, and investigate together the Miami Mall Monsters. This has been In the Shed with Wes Anderson, the best news show in the land covering politics, sports, and the paranormal. Have an adventurous and fulfilling weekend. I'll catch you tools later. Peace out, Boy Scout. Meemaw, we made it!
We sure did.